Now that we've got a handle on prompt evaluation, we're going to move on to the world of prompt engineering. Remember, prompt engineering is all about taking a prompt that we've written and improving it in some way to get more reliable outputs and higher quality outputs. To understand prompt engineering, we're going to go through a series of videos in this module, and I want to very quickly help you understand how the module is set up. In this video and the next, we're going to write out an initial prompt. And then in the coming videos, we're going to try to improve it step by implementing new prompt engineering techniques on that original prompt. So in short, in this video, we're going to set a goal, so something we want our prompt to do. We're then going to write an initial version of that prompt. So kind of like a really poor first attempt. We will then eval the prompt, and then we're going to see right away that we get a very poor evaluation score. And then, as I mentioned in the coming videos, we're going to learn about and apply some different prompt engineering techniques. And as we apply each of these, we're going to run our evaluation again and see that we are getting better performance with every single improvement we make. Now, to run these evals, we're going to use that same kind of eval pipeline that we put together in the previous module. Just one little twist here, something you really need to be aware of if you want to follow along and code with me. I took our original eval pipeline that we put together in the last module, and I made a couple of different improvements to it to make sure that it can work with just about any prompt, as opposed to the very specific prompt we were working on previously. So to get this updated notebook that has this more flexible evaluation pipeline, make sure you download the accompanying notebook named 001_prompting. Before we open up that notebook, however, I want to very quickly tell you about the goal of our prompt. So this initial prompt that we're going to write and exactly what it is intended to do. All right, so we're going to make a prompt that's going to hopefully generate a one-day meal plan for an athlete based upon their height, weight, some kind of physical goal that they might have, and any dietary restrictions they might have. So you can imagine that we are going to take in some kind of sample input that describes an athlete, maybe their height, weight, goal, and dietary restrictions. We're then going to interpolate all those inputs into our prompt, and then we're going to send that off to our model. And hopefully we'll get back some kind of output like what you see on the right-hand side. This is what we're really going for. This is our ideal output. In the first version of our prompt, we're going to get some output that looks nothing like what you see here on the right-hand side, but through a variety of different prompt engineering techniques, we're going to eventually refine the prompt and eventually hopefully get something that looks almost exactly like this. All right, so now that we understand our goal, let's open up that new notebook. So remember 001 prompting. I'm going to give you a very quick tour of it because a couple of things have changed compared to the last module, and just make sure everything inside there is super clear. We'll then use the notebook to generate our initial data set. All right, so I've opened up that notebook. Right away, you'll notice there are a couple of collapsed cells at the top. So this is a lot of different setup code. Just make sure you execute those cells at least one time. So I'm going to do so right away. Next up, you'll see that I'm creating an instance of something called a prompt evaluator. Prompt evaluator is a class I created that wraps up all the dataset generation, all the model grading, just about everything is wrapped up inside of this class. The class takes one argument, max concurrent tasks. So this class supports concurrency. We can make multiple API calls at the same time. The upside to this is that it's going to dramatically speed up our eval process and the dataset generation process as well. But I do need you to be aware that depending upon your service quota, you may or may not very quickly start to run into some rate limit errors. So if you see any rate limit errors at all as you go through this module, I would highly encourage you to change this value right here all the way down to the default of 1, which means no concurrency at all. For me personally, I have super high rate limits, so I'm going to dial this all the way up to a concurrency of 50. Chances are you are not going to be able to use 50. So don't try 50. I would really recommend maybe starting off at 3. And then if you see any rate limit errors, start to go down to 2 or 1. Again, I'm going to use 50 just so you can see some immediate feedback on my screen as I run all these different steps. Now I'm going to make sure I run that cell. And then let's get started on generating our actual data set. So to generate the data set, I've added this new generate dataset method for us. To use this method, we're going to describe the overall purpose of our prompt. So kind of what our prompt is supposed to do. For you and I, we're trying to work on a prompt that is going to write a compact, concise, one-day meal plan for a single athlete. And then inside of this prompt input spec, we're going to have a dictionary that's going to list out all the different inputs that our prompt requires. As we saw just a moment ago, our prompt is going to require a height, a weight, a goal, and some dietary restrictions. So these are some extra properties that are going to be generated as a part of the data set, and eventually we're going to take them test case by test case and interpolate them into our prompt. So I'm going to fill out all 4 of these different properties. My height is going to be the height in cm. And just to be clear, I'll put in athlete's height. And I'm going to duplicate that because it's going to be just about the same. We're going to do our weight in kilograms. My goal is going to be the goal of the athlete. And my restrictions will be dietary restrictions of the athlete. Now, last input for you to be aware of is number of test cases to generate. I would really recommend that you just leave this at 3 because it's going to allow you to get through this module way faster because the evals are going to run much more quickly. Just remember, as I mentioned many times, whenever we do an eval in reality, we want to have a really solid, really large number of test cases. So I'm going to dial mine personally way up. I do not recommend you do this. I recommend you leave it at like 2 or 3, just to make sure all your evals run very quickly. But again, I'm going to dial mine all the way up to 50. Once I put this all together, I'm going to run the cell, and that's going to generate my data set. Once I have generated my data set, I can open up the dataset.json file, which should be created in the same directory. And we're going to see all these different individual data sets have been generated. So they have a pretty similar structure to what we were doing on our previous module when we were talking about prompt evals. I'm going to go back over to my notebook and then scroll down a little bit to the run prompt function. This is where we are going to write out our prompt and then eventually improve it over time. This function gets called one time for every test case that you generated. Whenever this function is called, it's going to receive your test case's prompt inputs as its only argument. So in other words, prompt inputs right there is going to be that dictionary. And then that function is going to be called again, and it will be that dictionary. And then again, and it will be that dictionary, and so on. So we're going to take this dictionary, and we're going to interpolate those inputs into this prompt that we're going to write out right here. Let's immediately write out a first version of our prompt, and it's going to be very simple, very naive. We're going to get a very bad eval score, but it will at least get us started. So I'm going to write in my initial starting prompt here, and I'm going to use a very bad prompt. I'll say, what should this person eat? And then I'm going to list out their height, their weight, their goal, and dietary restrictions. And then for each of these, I'm going to interpolate in a value from prompt inputs. So the first one will be the height, and I'm going to copy paste that just to save a little bit of time and update the keys on each one. So make sure you have first height, and then we want the weight, and then our goal, and then restrictions. All right, once we have our starter prompt in here, I'm going to run that cell. And then let's do our eval. So we can run our eval down here at the very bottom. Now, before we run our eval, I want you to know that this function that's going to actually kick off the evaluation process, it takes in one additional keyword argument that I'm not showing here. It's called extra criteria. It's going to be a string. This string is going to be used during the model grading process. This extra criteria thing just allows you and I as developers to put in some extra criteria that the model should consider whenever it's doing some grading. So I'm going to say specifically to make sure that the output should include a daily caloric total, a macronutrient breakdown, and meals with exact foods, portions, and timing. Again, this is just going to add in a little bit of extra validation or a little bit of extra grading criteria. All right, so now let's run our evaluation for the first version of our prompt and see how we're doing. All right, we get a absolutely terrible score. I get a 2.32. Now, just so you know, you are probably going to end up getting a much better score than I get. The reason I have a very bad score here is that I'm using a model behind the scenes that is not super smart. So it's going to tend to give me really bad output unless I'm very specific in how I prompt it. I am using this very bad model just so you can see the increase in score over time as we go throughout this module and add in all these different prompt engineering techniques. So again, you are probably going to get a better score. That's totally fine. Now, before we move on, there's one last thing I want to mention really quickly. Whenever you run an evaluation, a file will be created in the same directory as your notebook called output.html. If you open up that file inside of your browser with a simple drag and drop, you're going to see a really nicely formatted report that gives you output on every single test case that was executed, along with the score, the reasoning, solution criteria, and so on. You could also see the actual output too. So I'm going to use this little dashboard quite a bit in order to take a look at the output of the eval and understand how I actually need to improve my prompt. All right, I apologize for the long video here, but now hopefully you have an idea of some of the setup that we're doing inside of this module. So now all we really have to do, as you can see, we have really bad score right now. All we have to do is start to improve our prompt. So let's start to take a look at our first prompt engineering technique in the next video.